My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is what I found behind a door at my grandmother's funeral and what it took for me to open it. I'm a paramedic. 9 years on an ambulance teaches you to walk into the worst 5 minutes of a stranger's life and stay steady. Airway first. Treat what kills fastest. Ask questions later. I thought that training had prepared me for anything. It hadn't prepared me for my own family's hallway. The reception was already loud with mourners and casserole dishes when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong at a funeral. A dryer running in the next room. Nobody does laundry during a wake. Underneath the hum of the machine, I caught something else. A knock. Soft. Patient. Coming from a closet under the stairs. I knew that knock. I'd known it my whole life. 2 knocks, soft, that was our signal. It's me. You're safe. I'd taught it to my little sister when she was small enough to fit her whole hand around one of my fingers, and small enough that a locked door felt like the biggest danger either of us could imagine. I was wrong about that too. The locked door was never the worst part. What came after I opened it, the years of paperwork, guardianship hearings, and a secret buried 2 generations deep, was so much worse that the closet almost felt like the easy part of the story. But I need to take you back further, because you won't understand what I did next unless you understand what was done first. I grew up in a small town where our family's name was on a storefront, the kind of place where everyone waves and nobody actually knows anybody. My sister was born when I was 10. She loved birds the way some kids love cartoons, completely, physically, with her whole small body. She'd flap her hands when finches landed at the feeder, like she might lift off with them if she flapped hard enough. When she was 4, a specialist gave my parents a word: autism. My mother's first reaction wasn't grief, and it wasn't fear for her daughter's future. It was a question about who else might find out. There was no early intervention after that appointment. No school, no speech therapist with a name anyone in town would recognize. There was a tutor who came in through the back door and got paid in cash, and a story for church about a delicate immune system. And there was the closet under the stairs. My mother called it the quiet room. She said my sister chose it herself, and sometimes that was even true. Loud rooms hurt her, and a small dark space with a pillow and a flashlight could feel like relief. I understood that, even as a kid. What I didn't understand, what I never understood, was why a room my sister chose needed a latch installed on the outside. I was 15 the fall they put it up. I stood in the hallway and watched the screws go in. I remember the exact sound the latch made the first time my mother tested it, a small brass click, neat and final, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody would ever be allowed to finish reading. I've hated that sound every day since. I knew it was wrong before I had the words for why. By the time I was 18, I had the words, and I had a night where church guests filled our house with perfume and noise, and my sister rocked and cried under the sound of Christmas carols while a plate of cookies sat outside a locked door. I got up in the middle of dinner. I opened that door. I carried her out in front of everyone. You'd have thought I'd brought a body into the room. What happened on the porch that night, with my father, with the police, with a plea deal that followed me for the next 14 years, is where this story really starts. Because the choice I made that Christmas didn't save my sister. It only bought her 14 more years behind that latch, while I stood outside a life I'd been legally warned to stay away from. My father walked me onto that porch by the arm like I was a stranger causing a scene at his church. In a way, I was. I just happened to also be his daughter. The quiet room is a family decision, he said. Calm. Final. Like he was closing a store register. A lock is not a decision, I told him. It's a cage. He shoved me. I was 18 and furious, and I shoved back harder than I should have, and he went through the screen door behind him. Glass everywhere. A neighbor called the police before either of us had time to feel ashamed. My father stood in red and blue light with blood over one eyebrow and told the responding officers his daughter was out of control. I took a misdemeanor plea. A trial would embarrass the family, my mother's words, said while she swept up glass that night like the whole evening was a mess she could tidy into silence. Family means nobody has to know, she told me. She meant the fight on the porch. She meant the closet. She meant I'd come to understand everything forever. I packed a bag within the week. The last thing I did in that house was kneel by the closet door and knock twice, soft. "It's me. You're safe." She knocked back. I told her through the wood that I'd come for her. It took 14 years to keep that promise. That's the part of this story I can't fix, no matter how the rest of it ends. I moved 2 hours away and enrolled in an EMT course because it was fast and it was work, and it turned out I was built for it. 9 years on a medic truck teaches you a certain arithmetic. Treat what kills first, worry about everything else after. I got very good at that arithmetic. I needed to be, because for 3 years running, every birthday gift I mailed home vanished into that house without a word back. The 4th year, a package came back marked return to sender, in my mother's handwriting. When I called, my mother answered like she was reading a prepared statement. "She's fine. She's thriving. She doesn't need to be confused." My father got on the line exactly once, and he kept it short. I still had a record, he still had a lawyer, and if I came around my sister again, he'd call it stalking and let a judge admire the pattern. Here's the thing people don't understand about family estrangement from the outside, and something I didn't fully understand myself until years later, sitting in a courthouse hallway listening to lawyers describe my own life like a case file. The abuser doesn't need proof to control the narrative. They just need to be the one filing the paperwork. Family court data backs this up in a way that would have made 18-year-old me feel less alone. In reported cases of elder or dependent adult abuse, the abuser is a family member roughly 9 times out of 10, and 2/3 of the time it's an adult child or a spouse standing where trust used to be. My family wasn't an aberration. My family was, statistically, exactly the kind of decision this system is built to miss. I drove down twice anyway, in those 14 years. Both times I sat in my truck across the street and watched my father flip the shop sign to closed, and I drove back with my hands aching on the wheel from gripping it too hard the whole way. I told myself that was weakness. Some nights I still think it might have been. But a woman with a record who forces her way past a legal warning doesn't rescue anybody. She hands her family the villain they've been waiting for, and my sister would have paid for that story every day for the rest of her life. So I stayed away. I got good at chest compressions and bad at sleeping through February. And then, on a gray Tuesday, a lawyer I'd never met called my station and asked for me by name. My grandmother was gone, and she'd left instructions that made sure, whatever else happened, I would come to the funeral. The funeral was beautiful the way a store window is beautiful. White lilies matched to the ribbon. A program printed on heavy paper. My family filled the front pew in coordinated navy, and the pastor called us a family that holds together, while my mother tilted her chin like the phrase was a crown being lowered onto her. I sat 3 rows back. Nobody saved me a seat. At the reception afterward, a small man in a brown suit found me by the coat rack. "Bill, my grandmother's lawyer for 40 years, with the handshake of a man who bills honestly and the eyes of a man who doesn't miss much." He told me my grandmother had left a special needs trust for my sister. Just over $200,000, meant to fund real care, therapy, a real life, pending the court sorting out the details. My aunt had been named temporary trustee. Then he leaned in and told me something that had apparently been sitting in his chest for 2 years. When my grandmother signed the trust paperwork, she tapped the documents and said, "So it never happens again." He asked if I knew what that meant. I didn't. Not yet. I was only half listening anyway, because I'd started doing the thing I do at a scene without deciding to, counting heads. Cousins buy the coffee. My mother refilling cups that were already full. Everyone accounted for except the one person the trust existed for. My sister wasn't in the living room. Wasn't in the kitchen. Wasn't in the yard. And under the murmur of 50 polite voices, coming from the back hallway of my parents' house, I heard a sound that made no sense at a funeral. The dryer was running. Nobody does laundry at a funeral. I followed that sound down a hallway I grew up walking. The dryer thumped behind a closed door, tumbling what turned out to be 2 towels, just enough noise to cover something. Past it, under the stairs. The closet. The old latch from my childhood was gone. In its place was a new one. Solid brass, bright against 14 years of repainted wall. Slid shut. Under the dryer's rhythm, I heard it. Faint. Steady. A knock, patient, almost polite, like someone being courteous about drowning. My training says announce yourself before you act. So I did the only version of that I know. I knocked twice soft. The knocking inside stopped. Then 2 knocks came back. I opened the door, and there was my sister, 22 years old now, sitting on a beanbag between winter coats, headphones over her ears, a coloring book on her knees. Thinner than any photo I'd been sent. Pale in the specific way people get when their whole world has a ceiling on it. She looked at me for a long moment. I watched her place me, the changed face, the years, all of it. Then she reached out and knocked her knuckles twice against the floor. It's me. You're safe. I was still on my knees in front of her when my mother's shadow fell across us both. She likes it in there, my mother said, voice pitched low, guests still in earshot. It's her safe space, Myra. She asked to go in. My father appeared behind her, jaw set. Don't make a scene at your grandmother's funeral. A scene. There it was again, the family religion, the same word that had followed me out the door 14 years earlier. And for the first time, I had a real name for my heresy. I looked at that shining new latch, mounted at adult height on the outside of the door, and one thought landed, calm and clear, the way things do when the adrenaline is real. Quiet is not the same as peace. I took out my phone and photographed the latch, while both my parents watched me do it. Then I helped my sister up, into the light, and I started doing the math I do at every call. How fast can I get her somewhere safe, and what's it going to cost me to try? I had no idea yet how much it would cost. Or that the paperwork my father was about to bring out of his study would matter more than anything I could carry her past. I had it all mapped out in under a minute. My sister in my truck. A hotel in the city for the night. Calls to make in the morning. My father watched me do that math like he'd been waiting for it the whole time. Then he walked to the study and came back with a folder, and he laid it on the kitchen counter between us the way you'd lay down a winning hand. Letters of guardianship. County probate court, raised seal. My parents named co-guardians of the person of my sister, an incapacitated adult. Signed the summer she turned 18. For years, and I'd never known, because the hearing notice went to family, and I'd stopped counting as family the night I went through a screen door. You take her out that door, my father said quietly, and it's abduction of a ward. Your word against ours. A woman with a record. He wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. I hated him with a completeness I have never felt for another human being before or since. Here's what I need you to understand, because it matters for everything that comes after. Walking out of that house without my sister was the hardest correct decision of my life. You don't beat a locked door by breaking it. You beat it by getting the key legally, permanently, in a way nobody can ever slide shut again. That's not just something I told myself to feel better on the drive home. It's backed by something I didn't know yet that day but learned fast in the months that followed. Guardianship in this country is one of the most powerful legal tools that exists, and courts are supposed to consider less restrictive alternatives before granting it. In practice, that requirement gets waved through more often than it gets enforced. Once a guardianship is signed, removing it or removing the person holding it is its own separate war. My father's folder wasn't a bluff. It was a door he'd built himself for years earlier, on the day nobody thought to warn me a hearing had even happened. I knelt by my sister where she still sat with her coloring book, knocked twice on the arm of her chair. She knocked twice back. And I walked out to my truck with car keys that felt like they weighed 40 pounds, because I was leaving the one person I'd promised to come back for. My aunt was waiting on the porch when I came out. 60-some years old, arms crossed like a woman guarding a gate. You always did like kicking doors open, she said. Some doors are closed for a reason. I'd remember that sentence later, standing in a lawyer's office, holding a photograph that would explain exactly what she meant by it. But that Monday, all I had was a phone in a station parking lot and a decision to make. I called it in, the latch, the photograph, the guardianship papers, for years of medical silence I suspected but couldn't yet prove. A caseworker got assigned. And I learned the first hard lesson of the system. I was about to spend a year inside. The system knocks before it comes in. And by the time it does, everyone's had time to answer the door looking exactly the way they want to be seen. A guardianship welfare check gets scheduled. Scheduled means warned. By the time the caseworker, I'll call her Ms. Cho, stood in my parents' hallway, the closet under the stairs held a vacuum cleaner and folded card tables. The latch was gone, for neat holes puttied over and painted. My sister sat in the good armchair with a puzzle, scrubbed and brushed like an exhibit at a museum. My mother served coffee cake. My father quoted scripture in that gentle voice he saves for when there's an audience. My sister didn't speak. She rarely speaks with strangers in the room, and nobody in that house had ever given her another way to answer. The preliminary finding came back in careful bureaucratic language, unable to substantiate. I read that phrase sitting in my truck for so long my coffee went cold in the cup holder. But two things happened underneath that finding, and I didn't learn about either one until much later. First, Ms. Cho didn't close the file. Something about a 22-year-old woman with no physician of record for 4 straight years had snagged in her, professionally, the way a loose thread snags a sweater. She flagged the case for a full guardianship review, which meant a courtroom, which meant a judge, which meant sworn answers under oath instead of coffee cake and scripture. Second, the photograph I'd taken of that brass latch went into the file. And files have a way of surfacing exactly when the people in them are praying hardest that they won't. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that a caseworker had stood 6 feet from my sister, and the paperwork had smiled back at her like nothing was wrong. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's not just my family's story. Courts across the country have struggled for years with a documented gap between how guardianship is supposed to work and how it actually gets monitored once it's granted. Government oversight reviews have repeatedly found that many guardians who went on to neglect or financially exploit the people in their care were never checked on again after that first court appointment. The system verifies you once, hands you the keys, and mostly trusts you not to misuse them. A welfare check that gives a family days of warning isn't a flaw in my parents' case specifically. It's closer to the system working exactly as poorly as it's designed to. If you've ever sat across from an official knowing the truth was in the room while the paperwork said otherwise, you already know what that drive back felt like. What came next, the one order in the guardianship review my parents couldn't charm their way around, was an independent medical evaluation. A doctor from the court's own list, not one my family had picked. And the name that came back was a woman who'd known my sister once, a long time ago, before her follow-up appointments became something my parents decided was drawing too much attention at church. I could have hugged the clerk who drew that name out of the file. Her name was Dr. Bennett. She ran a developmental clinic 2 counties over, and 30 years of being lied to by nervous parents had given her a very specific kind of patience, the kind that doesn't rush, doesn't flinch, and doesn't stop asking questions just because the answers are uncomfortable for the adults in the room. Her report was 40 minutes of appointment and 4 pages of quiet devastation. No physician of record in 4 years. No documented dental care anyone could produce. Skill regression across the board in a woman whose childhood chart had shown her learning letters. And then the part that put a lump in my throat standing in a courthouse hallway months later, reading it for the first time. As part of the evaluation, Dr. Bennett had set a basic communication tablet on the table in front of my sister, the kind with picture buttons and a keyboard. The kind my sister had never once, in 22 years, been offered. It took her a while to touch it. Then, one letter at a time, she pecked out the first word anyone had gotten from her in years. Not mom. Not help. My name. Dr. Bennett wrote in her report that my sister had demonstrated communicative capacity that had gone unsupported for years, and that in her professional opinion, this constituted neglect of care. This detail isn't unique to my family, either, and it's worth saying plainly. Taking away or simply never introducing a nonverbal person's communication device is one of the most well-documented and most underreported forms of control that caregivers and guardians exert. It doesn't look like abuse on paper. It looks like a household preference. She doesn't need all that, my mother would say to me later, almost exactly that phrase. It photographs as tidiness. It reads in a case file as nothing at all. That's what makes it effective, and it's exactly why a device showing up on a court-ordered evaluation table, unprompted and untouched until that day, mattered so much more than any of us understood in the moment. I called the lawyer that night and asked him if this meant it was over, if the judge would just hand her to me now. There was a pause I didn't like. Removing a guardian, he said, is not the same thing as choosing the next one. You need to hear that twice. My parents never got formally removed, and that detail tells you almost everything about how my family fights. The morning of the hearing, their lawyer stood up and announced they were voluntarily resigning as guardians for health reasons, heads high, reputations unfindable by any search of court records. No finding of neglect. No finding of anything. Just a graceful step to the side, and suddenly the only question left in that courtroom was who would step in to replace them. There were 2 petitions sitting on the judge's desk that morning. Mine. And my aunt's. I didn't know yet that the second name on that list would turn out to be more dangerous than either of my parents had ever been, because my parents had never learned to perform competence on paper. My aunt had spent 30 years running a business. She knew exactly how to make a file say whatever she needed it to say, and by the time I understood that, she'd already had a head start. Their lawyer stood up first, and he was worth whatever they were paying him. He didn't rant. He regretted. He regretted that a woman with a misdemeanor for putting her own father through a screen door now wanted control of a vulnerable adult, and, he noted almost gently, her substantial trust. He walked the judge through 14 years of absence, reframed as recklessness instead of exile. He asked the court to imagine a vulnerable woman alone in a 1-bedroom apartment while her sister worked 24-hour shifts on an ambulance, no set schedule, holidays included. What happens to her then? I watched the judge write something down, and I already knew it wasn't going to be good for me. Then my aunt took the stand in her Sunday coat, and she was magnificent. I'll give her that. A farmhouse 10 minutes from everything my sister knew. A retired husband, home all day. Letters of support from half the congregation. Family that steps up, her lawyer said, instead of family that shows up angry at funerals. The ruling took 20 minutes. Guardianship of the person and temporary control of the trust to my aunt. Scheduled visitation for me. Review in 1 year. On the courthouse steps, she actually hugged me. Put her mouth next to my ear and said, "We keep our own, Myra. You'll see." It took me 3 weeks to understand what keeping meant to her. The first visit, I wanted to believe it. A yellow bedroom, because someone had told her my sister liked yellow. Fresh cookies. My sister calm at the kitchen table with a puzzle. I sat in my truck afterward and let myself exhale for the first time in months. It felt, for a moment, like the system had stumbled sideways into something decent. But 2 small wrong details followed me home that day, the way the wrong details always do, right before a call goes bad. My aunt talked past my sister the entire visit, third person, over her head, while she sat right there. She eats good now. She doesn't need all that screen nonsense. My sister's hand-drawn picture schedule, the one from DR. Bennett's evaluation, was gone from the wall. In its place, a chore list in my aunt's handwriting. And on the stairway wall, in a line of family photographs marching up the steps, weddings, ribbons, my father as a young man in front of the store, there was a blank rectangle, brighter than the wallpaper around it. The shape of a small picture frame that had hung there long enough to leave a shadow, and someone had taken it down. I didn't ask what used to hang there. I should have. Because 2 calls later, one from a day program director whose name I'd need to remember, one from an uncle who'd never called me before and never called again, I'd learned that my aunt's first 3 moves as guardian weren't about care at all. And a woman with 20 years in the field would put a name to exactly what those moves were doing. The call came on a Thursday from a number I didn't know. A woman named Rachel ran the adult day program my sister had been enrolled in as a condition of the ruling, 3 days a week, everyone smiling about it in court. Rachel wasn't smiling now. My aunt had pulled my sister out effective immediately. Form letter, citing cost. The program wasn't cheap, but it was exactly the kind of care my grandmother's trust existed to fund, and the letter to the court called it a non-essential expense, preserving the ward's assets. The same week, a change of provider form moved my sister's medical care from Dr. Bennett's clinic to a telehealth service. More convenient, the paperwork said. Convenient for whom? It didn't say. Rachel talked to me for a long time that night. Careful. Professional. Absolutely clear. I've been doing this 20 years, she said. When a new guardian's first 3 moves are cancel the program, switch the doctor to a screen, shorten the visits, that's not budgeting. That's turning off the eyes. She couldn't report a feeling. She knew it, and it was eating her, because mandated reporters need something concrete to hand over, not a hunch, however correct the hunch turns out to be. So I did the one thing I could still do from where I stood. Through my lawyer, I filed a request for the trust accounting, something any interested family member is legally allowed to compel. My aunt had been trustee since my grandmother died. She now owed a judge the receipts. Third visit after that, I noticed what was missing before I even got my coat off. The communication tablet, the one Dr. Bennett had gotten issued through her clinic before the provider switch, was gone from my sister's room. My aunt didn't even pretend otherwise. She was hiding behind that thing, she said, wiping a counter that didn't need wiping. In this house, we talk like people. My sister sat at that table with her hands quiet in her lap. She'd have known I was coming. I always came the same day, and there was nothing left on that table for her to answer me with. When I hugged her goodbye, she grabbed my jacket sleeve in her fist and wouldn't let go. She made a sound low in her throat, one long note pushed out like something dragged from under a door. 9 years on a truck, I've carried people out of car wrecks. That sound is the one I still hear at night. I complained about the tablet through my lawyer within the week. My aunt's answer came back through the court, and it was a masterpiece, a behavior journal, in her own neat hand, documenting that after every visit from me, my sister was agitated, didn't sleep, refused tasks. Her recommendation, regretfully as guardian, shorter visits, supervised, for the ward's own stability. I sat on the shoulder of the road with that letter in my lap and finally understood the shape of the game, the way you understand ice under your boots the second before you fall. My aunt didn't need to prove she was good. She controlled every scrap of paper coming out of that farmhouse, and paper was all the court could see. She didn't need to be right. She just needed me to look wrong. So the 2 women who actually saved the story got smarter. The tablet handoff happened at the one place my aunt couldn't control or decline, the church picnic, in front of the pastor and the potato salad and everyone whose good opinion my family had spent 50 years buying. Dr. Bennett had found the crack in the paperwork first. If my aunt's own filing said care was moving to a telehealth screen, then the patient needed a device with communication software as durable medical support, prescribed under the evaluation the court itself had ordered. My aunt had chosen telehealth. Telehealth needed a tablet. Refusing it meant refusing the very doctor she'd picked on the record. Checkmate politely, in triplicate. Rachel built the replacement herself, same at my sister had already learned. Her old picture vocabulary restored from the program's files, everything laid out exactly where her hands remembered it. I got to be the one who delivered it at a picnic table in front of half the town. Medical equipment, I told my aunt, loud enough for the deacons to hear. Court-ordered follow-up. Feel free to call Dr. Bennett. My sister's hands hovered over it a long few seconds. Then she found her rhythm like she'd never lost it, icons, keyboard, home screen. And then she did something nobody had programmed and nobody had imagined. She opened the button editor herself. Typed 1 letter at a time. Picked the biggest size. Picked yellow. Saved her own sentence to the front page of her voice. I am not a secret. She pressed it once, and the tablet said it out loud, flat and small, right over the potato salad. I looked up expecting fury on my aunt's face. What was there instead was worse. She'd gone white as paper, like a woman looking at a ghost. The trust accounting she'd been fighting to keep to 1 page didn't survive what came after. A court-ordered amended filing turned up nearly $70,000 of my sister's inheritance rerouted into my aunt's own property, reimbursements for care no outside agency had ever been hired to provide. A roof invoice for a building that wasn't my sister's, a truck titled to my uncle and justified as ward transportation. My grandmother, so it never happens again, had been paying for shingles. What followed was ugly and fast. My aunt suspended my visitation entirely, citing her own behavior journal. My sister was moved, quietly, out of the yellow bedroom on paper and into a motel room in fact, while a caseworker's follow-up visit sat scheduled 10 days out, 10 days I measured, the way I measure everything, in the time it takes for a bad situation to become an unsurvivable one. A heat wave was coming that weekend. I won't walk you through the 3 a.m. dispatch call again in detail. Some of you already know how that morning ended, in a gravel lot, with my sister barefoot and dehydrated and still, somehow, clutching a tablet with a cracked screen because she'd climbed out a window to save herself rather than wait for anyone else to. What matters is what came after, in a lawyer's office, in a sealed box my grandmother had left behind with one instruction: open it only if the trust ever ended up in a fight. Inside was a photograph of 2 boys in front of our family store. My father, maybe 8, grinning. Beside him, a smaller boy with a crooked collar and eyes that didn't meet the camera. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, a name I'd never once heard spoken in that family: my father's brother. Sent away at 6. Dead at 9, in an institution, buried under a number instead of a name. My grandmother's trust wasn't estate planning. It was the only confession my family ever knew how to write. At the hearing, I told the court the worst version of my own story before anyone else could. The record, the 14 years, the failure that belonged to every adult with my last name, mine included. Then I asked for something smaller than full guardianship, a supported decision-making arrangement built around my sister's own choices, with me standing beside her life instead of owning it. The judge asked if my sister wanted to answer for herself. My aunt's lawyer objected. He was overruled. 50 people listened to someone type. My sister pressed her yellow button first, "I am not a secret," and then, letter by letter, added her own words, unprompted, "I want to live with my sister. She knocks before she opens the door." My aunt stood up in the middle of the ruling, gripped the rail, and walked out without a word. She was later removed as guardian and trustee, ordered to pay restitution, barred permanently from ever serving as anyone's fiduciary again. 8 months later, my sister has her picture scheduled back on our refrigerator, in her own hand. She's enrolled 5 days a week in a program she chose. Wednesdays are tacos, 30 weeks running, and God willing, forever. And once, we drove out together to a small cemetery, to a stone that used to have only a number on it, and now has a name: a great-uncle, seen at last, more than 50 years too late. She laid a card from her tablet against the base of it. "You are not a secret anymore." Then she knocked on the granite, twice, gently. That was the whole ceremony. It was enough.